At the springs of Cresson, the destruction of the Crusader knights before Saladin. In the spring of the 88th year of the 12th century, the sky above the Holy Land was filled with such tension as the silence before a storm. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had stood under Christian rule for 9 decades, was unknowingly approaching its own destruction. In this world, where knightly honor and religious fanaticism intertwined, it was not the greatest battles that definitively turned the wheel of history, but often smaller, seemingly insignificant clashes. The encounter at the springs of Cresson was precisely such an event, a tragic prelude that foreshadowed the coming catastrophe. To understand this story, however, we must go back in time to see how the Christian East reached this fragile point. At the end of the 11th century, when the first Crusaders marched into Jerusalem, it seemed that God was truly with his people. The Crusader states flourished, castles were built, cities grew wealthy. This golden age, however, did not last forever. By the middle of the 12th century, the situation had changed. The Muslim world, which had been fragmented and divided during the time of the First Crusade, gradually unified. And this unification had a name, had a face: Saladin. This leader of Kurdish origin, who began as the ruler of Egypt, gradually extended his power over Syria, Mesopotamia, and the surrounding territories. His goal was clear: to unite the Muslim world and drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land. Around the year 85, Saladin was already strong enough to openly challenge the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusader state, meanwhile, was struggling with internal problems. King Baldwin IV, whom history knows as Baldwin the Leper, was a ruler of incredible willpower who was able to lead his country even in illness. However, in the spring of 85, the disease finally conquered him, and after his death, the kingdom sank into such a political crisis that it almost dissolved all the defensive capabilities of the state. The new king, the barely 11-year-old Baldwin V, ruled only in name. The real power was in the hands of regents and nobles who constantly competed with each other. Between Guy de Lusignan, who later became king, and Raymond, Count of Tripoli, there was a particularly sharp conflict. Raymond was an advocate of moderate policy, peace with Saladin, at least until Christian forces could be strengthened. Guy and his supporters, however, represented the hard line: immediate war before it was too late. In this divided world, 2 knightly orders represented the backbone of the Christian military elite: the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers. These monastic knights dedicated their lives to the defense of the Holy Land. They vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience, but on the battlefield they fought with such courage and cruelty that made them legendary. Saladin's soldiers respected them, but at the same time hated them, knowing that these men would never surrender and would rather die than turn their backs on the enemy. The then Grand Master of the Templars was Gerard de Ridefort, a man whose name would later become almost synonymous with reckless stupidity. Gerard was a Norman knight who, upon arriving in the Holy Land, quickly rose through the Templar hierarchy. He was a tall, powerfully built man, characterized by a fiery temperament and impulsive decisions. His contemporaries judged him with mixed feelings. Some considered him a brave warrior, others an irresponsible adventurer. The chain of events began in the spring of 88. Saladin decided it was time to put pressure on the Crusaders. He mobilized his army and crossed the kingdom's border. The goal of the attack was not complete conquest, at least not then, but rather reconnaissance and intimidation. Saladin knew that the Christian camp was divided, and he wanted to show that he could strike at any time. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, who was then acting as regent of the kingdom, found himself in a delicate situation. On the one hand, he had to see that Saladin's threat was real. On the other hand, he knew that an open confrontation would be catastrophic, as the Christian forces were not organized in unity. Therefore, he made a peculiar and later much debated decision. He concluded a truce with Saladin. This truce allowed Saladin's troops to pass through Raymond's Galilean possessions without encountering resistance. In exchange, Saladin promised not to seize any of Raymond's castles and only to pass through the territory. This agreement outraged the hardliners, who considered Raymond's move to be treason. Gerard de Ridefort was particularly furious. In his view, a Crusader knight must never give way to the enemy, even if it seemed tactically wise. On the 1st of May in the year 88, Saladin indeed kept his word, and his 7,000-strong army appeared at the borders of Galilee. Al-Afdal, Saladin's son, led the troops, among whom were light cavalry, heavily armored Mamluk warriors, and Kurdish mountain fighters. The army truly just passed through. They did not pillage, did not loot, just moved northward, as if they wanted to demonstrate their strength. Gerard de Ridefort, however, could not accept this humiliation. The Templar Grand Master was staying in Nazareth at the time when he received news of Saladin's army approaching. He immediately summoned the Crusader knights from the surrounding area. The Templar fortress could barely mobilize 100 knights, but Gerard did not wait. He had no time, he had no patience, and most importantly, he had no sound judgment either. When he learned that the local commander of the Hospitallers, Roger de Moulins, was also nearby, Gerard sent a messenger to him. The Grand Master of the Hospitallers was a wise, experienced warrior who knew Saladin's tactics well. Roger immediately responded to Gerard's call and joined the Templars, but when he heard Gerard's plan to attack an army 7 times larger, he tried to dissuade the Norman knight. "Master brother," Roger said, "these numbers do not favor us. If we attack, it will be suicide. Let us wait until more reinforcements arrive." But Gerard would not hear of it. His response became legendary in its reckless arrogance. "You have lived too long already, Roger, if you fear death." This sentence deeply offended the Hospitaller master, but Gerard did not stop there. "I would rather go to hell with the Templars than go to heaven with cowards." According to contemporary chronicles, at this point, Roger gave up arguing. He knew that Gerard's blind pride would not yield, and since knightly honor did not allow him to refuse help to a Crusader brother, Roger and his Hospitallers joined the Templars. Thus, approximately 140 knights assembled in total, 110 Templars and about 30 Hospitallers. Beside them were also several dozen Syrian Christian fighters and local mercenaries. At dawn on the 2nd of May, the small Crusader army set out from Nazareth. Gerard knew that Saladin's troops had camped near the springs of Cresson to water their horses and rest. The spring was a place seemingly barren among the Galilean hills, but there was plenty of water, and the surrounding terrain was relatively open, an ideal place for a Muslim army preparing for cavalry maneuvers. Gerard's plan was simple, even primitive. Launch a surprise attack, devastate the enemy camp before they were fully prepared, and then quickly withdraw before the enemy could recover. There was a certain logic to the plan. Such a quick raid could even have been successful if the numerical ratio had not been so unequal, and if Saladin's soldiers had not been such experienced warriors. When the Crusader knights reached the top of the hill from where they finally saw the springs of Cresson, their breath stopped. The Arab army was enormous. Thousands of tents covered the plain, thousands of horses grazed in the nearby pastures, and soldiers swarmed in such numbers as if an entire migration of peoples had descended upon the region. Roger de Moulins again tried to dissuade Gerard. "Do you see how many there are? This is no longer a battle, this will be a massacre." But Gerard did not back down. "A Templar must not fear death," he replied, and gave the order to attack. The knights crossed themselves one last time, then seized their lances, spurred their horses, and started down the hillside. The Arab chroniclers also recorded this spectacle. Baha ad-Din, who served as a scribe at Saladin's court, reported thus: "We saw the Frankish knights coming from the hill, their armor gleaming in the sunlight and their swords flashing. There were so few of them that at first we could not believe they dared to attack. But then we heard their war cry, and we knew this was no jest." The Crusader charge was indeed effective at first. The knights crashed into the Arab lines with such speed and force that they simply swept away the first ranks. The charge of heavy armored cavalry always inspired fear, even when the enemy was experienced. The combination of the Crusader lance and the armored horse seemed almost invincible. But Saladin's soldiers were not beginners. After the initial surprise, they quickly reorganized their ranks. The light cavalry began to encircle the Crusader knights from the flanks, while the heavily armored Mamluks engaged them head-on. And most importantly, the numerical superiority was simply overwhelming. Even if every Crusader knight defeated 10 enemies, there would still be many left. Gerard de Ridefort fought in the thick of battle, his sword flashing quickly, and he allegedly killed at least 10 enemies personally. But no matter how brave he was, the battle was lost in the first minutes. Roger de Moulins, who knew the situation was hopeless, tried to gather his Hospitallers and break out of the encirclement. But it was too late. The Arab lines closed around them like a vice. The Hospitaller Grand Master had his horse shot out from under him. He himself continued fighting on foot, but after a few minutes, a Muslim sword cut him down. Gerard de Ridefort's horse also fell, but the Arab warriors captured him alive. According to Arab chronicles, Saladin's son, Al-Afdal, personally ordered that Gerard's life be spared. Such a high-ranking prisoner was too valuable to be simply killed. The battle lasted barely an hour. When it ended, the terrain around the springs of Cresson was covered with the dead. Almost all of the Crusader knights had fallen. Of the 140 knights, only 3 escaped. Gerard de Ridefort, who was taken prisoner, and 2 other knights who managed to break through and gallop back to Nazareth. Arab losses were also significant. The Crusader charge had taken its toll before it was broken. But for them, this was only a minor loss in a great victory. Saladin, when he received news of the battle, accepted the result with mixed feelings. On the one hand, he was satisfied that the Crusaders had suffered such a quick and decisive defeat. On the other hand, he was somewhat embarrassed because he had concluded a truce with Raymond, and this battle, although he had not started it, still violated the agreement. But in the end, he decided that the responsibility was Gerard's. He was the one who attacked the Muslim army, not Saladin, who acted in self-defense. This argument allowed Saladin to maintain his authority and not lose Raymond's trust, at least for the time being. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, however, was desperate when he heard the news. He knew that his political enemies would use this stupid, irresponsible action against him. And indeed, Guy de Lusignan and his supporters immediately accused Raymond that this tragedy could happen because of his betrayal. If Raymond had not let Saladin onto his territory, our knights would still be alive, they argued. Gerard de Ridefort, whom Saladin released after a few weeks, probably because he knew that Gerard's stupidity caused more harm to the Crusaders than benefit, naturally did not accept responsibility for his actions. Instead, he also blamed Raymond, saying that the Count's truce had encouraged Saladin to attack. If you are interested in what became of this catastrophe's continuation, and how the tragedy at the springs of Cresson led to the even greater Battle of Hattin, then stay with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the most exciting stories of the Crusades. The encounter at the springs of Cresson was therefore not significant in itself. From the Christian world's perspective, this was a minor incident that cost the lives of barely a few dozen knights. Its impact, its psychological consequence, however, was invaluable. It proved that the military leadership of the Crusader states was weak, divided, and irresponsible. It showed Saladin that the enemy was politically divided, and that if he attacked with enough force, the Crusader states would collapse. And indeed, barely a few weeks later, in the summer of 88, Saladin attacked with full force. His goal was no longer just to raid or demonstrate his strength, but to definitively deal with the Crusader presence. The Battle of Hattin, which occurred a few months after the tragedy at the springs of Cresson, definitively proved that Saladin had seen all this correctly. The Crusader army suffered a massive defeat, Jerusalem fell, and the Christian East was almost completely destroyed. But why do we attribute such great significance to this small battle? Why do we remember it when there were larger, more decisive battles? Because the springs of Cresson was the moment when everything was decided. This was the point where the stupidity and division of Christian leadership became so clear that catastrophe became inevitable. Gerard de Ridefort's figure in this story is almost tragic. He was the man who embodied the knightly ideal in every respect: brave, strong, committed. But he lacked wisdom, prudence, and humility. And it was precisely these shortcomings that made him not a hero, but a symbol of stupidity. Most medieval chroniclers harshly judged Gerard. Even those who otherwise glorified the Templars were forced to admit that Gerard's irresponsible decision caused incalculable damage. The figure of Roger de Moulins, by contrast, appears in the sources as a tragic hero. He was the one who knew the battle was hopeless, who tried to stop the madness, but in the end followed Gerard's command out of honor. And it was this honor that caused his death. The Hospitaller Order deeply mourned their Grand Master, and for decades remembered him as a man who chose to die rather than break his knightly oath. Contemporary Arab sources view this battle with interest. Baha ad-Din writes, "The Frankish knights fought as bravely as one expects from an enemy. But courage is not enough when wisdom is lacking. One had to see these men attack heroically, knowing they were going to their deaths. Respect is due to them for this, but also pity, because what a waste of life this was." This ambivalent assessment characterizes medieval Arab literature. Saladin and his court respected the Crusader knights as warriors, but did not understand why they were willing to commit such follies. The Islamic military tradition placed much greater emphasis on tactics, patience, and prudence. An attack like the one Gerard de Ridefort committed would be considered not just courage, but outright madness in the eyes of an Arab commander. The reaction of the Crusader world, however, was bitter and divided. After his return, Gerard de Ridefort tried to wash his hands of responsibility. He claimed that the battle was lost because, due to the treason of Raymond, Count of Tripoli, Saladin's troops appeared unexpectedly and in great numbers. This argument, however, was not convincing. Most contemporary chroniclers saw that Gerard's own irresponsibility had caused the catastrophe. The Templar order was internally divided over Gerard's leadership. Some still supported him, arguing that a knight must not retreat before the enemy, even if the odds were overwhelming. Others, however, especially the more experienced warriors, knew that Gerard's reckless decision not only lost the battle, but weakened the entire order. But the greatest losers were the prisoners, those Templars and Hospitallers who did not die immediately, but fell into Saladin's captivity. According to Arab tradition, enemy warriors could be ransomed for payment. But Saladin particularly hated the military orders because, according to their oath, they never surrendered and always offered the most determined resistance. Therefore, most Templar and Hospitaller prisoners could not be ransomed. Saladin either executed them or sold them into slavery. The Christian world deeply mourned the victims of the springs of Cresson. 140 knights does not seem like much, but these were not ordinary soldiers. These were the elite, the best trained warriors who had spent years in the Holy Land and whose knowledge and experience were invaluable. Their loss left such a gap in the Crusader defense system that could not be quickly filled. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, who was attacked from all sides in the political skirmishes after the Springs of Cresson, was forced to give up his regency and reconcile with Guy de Lusignan. This reconciliation, however, was only formal. The trust between these two men was permanently destroyed, and this destroyed trust, this internal division, played an even greater role in bringing about the Hattin catastrophe than the military superiority itself. The encounter at the Springs of Cresson is thus a perfect example of how individual stupidity can lead to collective tragedy. Gerard de Ridefort was one man who made a decision. But this decision set in motion a chain reaction that ultimately led to the fall of an entire kingdom. And in this sense, the Springs of Cresson was not just a battle, but a turning point, the moment when the path to catastrophe became irreversible. Historians still debate to what extent the Hattin catastrophe was unavoidable. Some argue that Saladin was so strong that he would have defeated the Crusaders sooner or later anyway. Others claim that if the leadership of the Crusader states had been more unified and wiser, perhaps they could have held out until help arrived from Europe. But one thing is certain: the folly at the Springs of Cresson brought the Christian East closer to its end than anything else that spring. Gerard de Ridefort, incidentally, survived the Battle of Hattin as well. Although he was captured, he was later released. But a few years later, around 99, he finally fell in another battle. After his death, The Templars elected a new Grand Master, who was much more prudent. By then, however, it was too late. The fate of the Christian East was practically sealed. The Springs of Cresson today is just a small, insignificant place in Galilee. Tourists rarely visit it, and no memorial plaque indicates that 140 Crusader knights once died here. But if we look at it from the perspective of history, this place has become as important as Hattin or Arsuf, because this was the moment when the Crusader world definitively lost its balance and the final fall began. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of this story. It is not always the great battles that decide the outcome of war. Sometimes a small, seemingly insignificant clash triggered by a foolish, impulsive decision can be more important than an entire campaign. The Springs of Cresson was such an event, a tragic, avoidable catastrophe that showed that courage alone is not enough. It needs wisdom, prudence, and humility as well. And this lesson is worth remembering not only for medieval knights. Even today, in every age, in every war and every conflict, it remains true. Even people with the best intentions and the greatest courage can cause terrible harm if their courage is not accompanied by wisdom. Gerard de Ridefort was not a bad man. He was not a coward. He was not a traitor. But he was irresponsible. He was reckless, and this killed him. A multitude of his knights, and ultimately the kingdom of Jerusalem itself. And perhaps we should pause and reflect on what this story actually tells us about the nature of human action, about the boundary between courage and recklessness, between loyalty to ideals and blind stubbornness. Gerard de Ridefort was a product of his time, a time when knightly honor and military glory were considered the highest values. He was raised in the belief that a knight must never retreat, that death in battle is honorable, and that compromise with the enemy is weakness. In this sense, Gerard de Ridefort was not just an individual failure, but a symptom of a broader crisis in Crusader thinking. The Crusader states in the Holy Land were always fragile entities, dependent on constant support from Europe, on diplomatic skill, and on the ability to find a balance between ideological intransigence and pragmatic survival. Gerard de Ridefort represented that part of Crusader society that had lost the ability to maintain this delicate balance. For him, only absolute values existed, either victory or death. Compromise, caution, strategic sacrifice. These were all words that his mental framework could not comprehend. It is interesting to compare Gerard's character with other great commanders of the Crusades. Take, for example, Richard the Lionheart, who led the Third Crusade a few years later. Richard was also known for his courage and aggression, but he was able to combine it with tactical cunning. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard also had to face the temptation to attack too early, but he was able to control himself and wait for the right moment. That was the difference between a great commander and merely a brave warrior. Or take Baldwin IV, the leper king. Despite his disease, which gradually paralyzed and blinded him, Baldwin was able to remain a cool-headed strategist. At the Battle of Montgisard in the year 1177, when Baldwin led a Crusader army against a much larger Saladinian force, he also risked everything. But his decisions were not driven by emotions. They were driven by cold calculation of the situation and military necessity. Gerard de Ridefort did not have this ability. His decision at the Springs of Cresson was neither brave nor strategic. It was simply stupid. And the worst part of the whole thing was that he dragged others into his stupidity. Roger de Moulins, Grand Master of the Hospitallers, was a much wiser man. He knew the attack was suicide. But the rituals of knightly honor that ruled Crusader society forced him to follow Gerard to his death. This is another tragic dimension of the entire story. It was not just Gerard's individual failure. It was a systemic problem of knightly culture. The values that were considered noble in Europe, courage, loyalty, refusal to retreat, became a huge weakness in the Holy Land. Saladin and his emirs knew these values well and were able to exploit them. They knew that Crusader knights could be provoked into reckless attacks. They knew that their pride would not allow them to retreat, even when it would be strategically correct. And Saladin exploited this weakness in many battles. At the springs of Cresson, it was almost a textbook demonstration. Let the Crusaders see your army, provoke them, wait until they attack with inferior numbers, and then surround them. At Hattin, it was similar. Saladin was able to maneuver the Crusader army into a disadvantageous position and then let it cook on a scorching hill while Muslim archers decimated it from a safe distance. The springs of Cresson was thus a warning that no one took seriously. It proved that the Crusader leadership was incapable of learning from its mistakes, that pride and ideology prevailed over pragmatism, and that internal division was so deep that no external threat could overcome it. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, who had been trying all along to negotiate peace, or at least a truce with Saladin, was even more isolated after Cresson. His political enemies used the catastrophe to accuse him of treason. Guy de Lusignan, who was a much less capable leader than Raymond, was able to exploit the mood in society and eventually take full control of the kingdom. And it was under Guy's leadership that the Hattin catastrophe occurred. We can speculate about what would have happened if Gerard de Ridefort had made a different choice that day in May of '88. What if he had listened to Roger de Moulins and waited for reinforcements? What if he had been willing to endure the humiliation of seeing a Muslim army pass through Galilee without attacking it? Would it have been possible to avert the Hattin catastrophe? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. History does not know subjunctive moods. What we know for certain, however, is that the battle at the springs of Cresson fundamentally weakened the Crusader defense. 140 elite knights were lost in a few hours because of one bad decision. And what was even worse, morale was shaken. The Crusaders discovered that their own leadership was incompetent, their own strategy suicidal. Saladin, on the other hand, gained a huge injection of confidence. He saw that the Crusaders were ready to do foolish things, that they could be provoked, that their leadership was unstable. This encouraged him to launch a full-scale invasion the following month, which led to the Battle of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem. There is yet another interesting dimension to the entire story: the question of personal responsibility versus systemic failure. It would be easy to blame only Gerard de Ridefort. After all, he was the one who made the fatal decision. But is it really that simple? Gerard was a product of the system that created him. He was raised in a culture that taught him that a knight must never retreat. He was promoted to leadership of the Templar order by a system that favored determination over wisdom. He operated in a society that rewarded him for his courage and would have pilloried him for caution. In this sense, Gerard de Ridefort was a victim as much as a perpetrator. He was a victim of social norms and values that shaped him and that did not give him the tools to decide correctly. This, of course, does not excuse his decision. Every person bears responsibility for their actions, but it helps us understand why it happened. And here we arrive at a more universal lesson. History is full of examples where people made catastrophic decisions, not because they were stupid or evil, but because they operated within a value system that led them in the wrong direction. World War I began partly because European elites were prisoners of diplomatic alliances and notions of national honor that forced them to escalate. Vietnam was a catastrophe, partly because American leadership was prisoner to the domino theory and fear of losing prestige. Gerard de Ridefort at the springs of Cresson is not just a medieval story. It is a story about how cultures create mental frameworks that lead people to bad decisions. It is a story about how institutions can fail by prioritizing loyalty over competence, courage over wisdom. And it is also a story about the price of pride. Gerard de Ridefort was a proud man in a proud society. He could not bear the thought of retreating before Saladin. He could not accept that sometimes it is wiser to wait, and this inability to accept reality cost him his life. And much more than that, it cost the lives of 139 other men who followed him to their deaths. If there is a single lesson we should take away from the story of the springs of Cresson, it is this: courage without wisdom is not virtue, it is danger. Loyalty without judgment is not faithfulness, it is blind obedience. And honor without reason is not nobility, it is arrogance. The Crusader states in the Holy Land may never have had a long-term future. They were islands of Christian power in a Muslim ocean, dependent on constant supplies of men and resources from Europe, which was thousands of kilometers away. Perhaps they would have fallen even without the springs of Cresson and without Hatton, but they certainly would have lasted longer if their leadership had been wiser and more capable of overcoming their own ideological limitations. Roger de Moulins understood this. That is why he tried to warn Gerard. But he could not stop him, because the system did not allow it. And so he went with his men into a suicidal battle, because that is what knightly honor demanded. His death was not just the loss of one man, it was the loss of one of the few voices of reason in a Crusader society that so desperately needed it. So we return to the original question: why do we remember the springs of Cresson when it was a relatively small battle? Because it was the moment when the entire tragedy of the Crusader project in the Holy Land became visible. In this one battle, everything came together: political division, poor leadership, unrealistic values, inability to learn, pride, and finally, catastrophe. And because it was a moment that could have been averted. Unlike great historical forces, which are often beyond human control, the battle at the Springs of Cresson was the result of specific decisions by specific people. Gerard de Ridefort could have decided differently. Raymond could have been more assertive. Roger could have refused to follow Gerard. Each of these points represented an opportunity to prevent catastrophe, but it did not happen, and the result was predictable and horrific. 137 knights dead on a scorching Galilean hillside, their bodies left to be scavenged by wild beasts, their blood soaked into the parched earth, and a few months later, a much greater catastrophe at Hatton, where the entire Crusader army was destroyed and Jerusalem was lost. The Springs of Cresson is thus a memento, a reminder of how important wisdom in leadership is, a reminder of how dangerous unreflected values and ideologies can be, a reminder that courage, though admirable, must be tempered by judgment, and a reminder that individual decisions can have collective consequences far beyond the original intent. When we stand today over the small spring in Galilee, the place is quiet and peaceful. Nothing suggests that here, more than 800 years ago, a tragedy unfolded that changed the course of history. But if we close our eyes and listen, perhaps we can still hear the distant echoes of battle cries, the clang of iron on iron, the screams of dying men. And perhaps, if we listen really carefully, we will also hear Roger's voice as he tries to warn Gerard. We will hear the final words of prayers from knights who knew they were going to their deaths. We will hear Gerard's proud cry, "Rather to hell with the Templars." And perhaps, just perhaps, we will also hear a quieter voice, the voice of reason and wisdom that was drowned out by the noise of pride and fanaticism. This is the voice that history offers us if we are willing to listen. A voice that tells us, learn from these mistakes, do not make them again. Remember that courage without wisdom leads to destruction. If you enjoyed this story and are interested in how the tragedy of the Crusader world continued, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Press the like button, share this video with your friends, and write a comment about what you think of Gerard's decision. Was he a brave hero or an irresponsible fool? How do you judge him? See you in the next video, where we will continue the fascinating and tragic story of the Crusades.